Hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's lecture. This week we'll be focusing on the rise of the New England colonies and the influence of a particularly small yet influential Protestant, ultra-conservative, you can say, sect called the Puritans. And we'll be focusing on not just their history in the New World, but we'll also be looking at how they influenced Hello everyone, welcome to this week's lecture. This week we'll be focusing on the establishment of primarily in the New England colonies, and many of the New England colonies founders, which were made up primarily of a very small yet very influential in terms of history of the colonies religious sect called the Puritans. Now, Puritans themselves were it was a very small, very ultra devout sect of Protestantism, and you could say that they were even more Protestant than the most influential Protestant establishment in England, which was the Church of England, established when Henry VIII broke away from the Catholic Church. However, Puritans thought that the Church of England didn't go far enough, and they wanted to purify the Church of England. They felt that there was too many Catholic rituals, too similar of a hierarchy in the Church of England. They want to dispel any evidence of any kind of popery or papal influence, anything of that nature. Okay. However, they did share the belief with the Church of England in terms of their hatred of the Catholic Church. Now, this particular sect of Protestantism believed in the Calvinist absolution that basically deemed a person either among the elect or the damned. And at birth, you were basically, your destiny, your fate was predetermined. It was already decided by God. And you could, however, sway the grace of God through your good deeds and through the actions of your life, but by and large, your fate was already determined. And as you can imagine, this particular religious sect angered quite a few people. Now remember, the Church of England was still a very young church, and it was still evolving itself. Okay? So, as a result, and as we'll see, they were, well, in a word, driven out. Now, among the first settlers in the New World, especially in New England, a good number of settlers were from Puritan or influenced by Puritan beliefs. Now, Foner starts out the chapter by discussing this concept of Puritan freedom. Remember, we have this changing theme of freedom and of this changing theme of liberty over time and over situations and different definitions depending on who's providing the definition. Okay. Now we had the first governor of Virginia. Excuse me, not Virginia, of Massachusetts, specifically the Massachusetts Bay Colony, John Winthrop, discussed this concept of Puritan freedom. He indicated, and this is something very similar to what we were seeing in terms of the Spanish interpretation, Spanish view of Native Americans. We see a little bit of overlap. Now, first he discussed that Puritan freedom, and it's deliberately, the word freedom is deliberately put in quotations, had two parts. Now, you can either have natural liberty, which one was lacking Christianity. You were undisciplined. You were unbridled. And in his words, he said, a liberty to do evil. Now, among those who were considered as having natural liberty were the Irish, who were Catholic, and Indians. So we see a little bit of overlap in terms of the viewpoint towards the opinion of Native Americans by the English. There's a little bit of similarities. Now, the other form of Puritan freedom was considered moral liberty. This was a type of liberty that assumed that you, as a Christian, had a spirituality. Okay, and you did have the right to worship, and you governed oneself in a Christian manner. However, there were restraints on your behavior. There were restraints on speech, religion, and personal behavior. And also, you subjected yourself to authority. That was also a very important key. Now, as we see the rise of colonies, we see a need to create a society around these freedoms. Okay, because remember, the Puritans, they felt that England, it was a difficult task to do in England to create this Christian society. They wanted to create, and this is a theme and a concept that we hear over and over again. We even hear politicians talk about this. And in Washington, this is a very commonly used term in terms of the desire to create a utopian society. And then John Winthrop's words, he wanted to create this city upon a hill. In his words, he said, "For we must consider that we shall be a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us, so that if we shall deal falsely with our God in this work we have undertaken, and so cause him to withdraw his present help from us, we shall be made a story and byword throughout the world." And I just want to point out that the typos are not typos at all. Those were written as it was typed as it was written down in John Winthrop's own words. Because remember, we're still in a period of early modern English, so you're going to see spellings that are a little bit different than modern English. This the most popular group of Puritans in American history, and this is a group of Puritans that you've probably talked about since you were very small, and this particular group would be the Pilgrims. Now, they're pretty much an example of a group, like many other Puritan groups, who were forced ultimately to flee. Initially, the Pilgrims, or what we would know as the Pilgrims, initially fled to Netherlands in 1608, but were eventually driven out and then sailed back to England. However, by 1620, 150 settlers and crew, which also included non-Puritans alike, boarded the Mayflower and sailed to the Americas. During this journey, of course, there were deaths. 102 survived, and their voyage was principally financed by the Massachusetts Bay Company because they wanted to establish a trading network with local Indians. Now, did they land at Plymouth Rock, as the famous narrative likes to indicate? Well, not really. We in fact don't really know exactly where they landed specifically. There are two commonly held theories, which is still very much subject to debate. Now, one is that the Mayflower landed where it did due to navigation error, because sailors of the period really knew how to calculate latitude. The other theory is that there was a storm, and they would have sailed south again once the storm had subsided. Okay, and upon landing, the adult men drew up an agreement which became known as the Mayflower Compact, and you see it there on the right for you to read. And this is a good example of a primary document. As you can tell, it's a lot less formal than, say, the Constitution, which I'm sure many of you have seen in various forms. So this is an agreement between adult men, and it was the first written document really outlining any kind of governmental framework in what is now the United States, and it would help to influence, as we'll discover, ultimately the Constitution of our United States. Now, in this particular document, which became really a sacred text in really modern textbooks, usually cover this, usually in high school history, at least I hope you did. In it, basically, the signers basically agreed to obey just and equal laws. Okay. Now, I mentioned that it had influenced the Constitution. Well, it influenced democracy, but in other areas, maybe not. It's one of those. Again, this is one of those items that are still up to debate, depending on which scholars you talk to, whether you talk to historians or political scientists. Now, according to Foner, and as I just mentioned, the exact site is still also very much under debate. The site really near Plymouth had been abandoned by Indian inhabitants who had died of smallpox a few years before. And Native Americans throughout the southern area of New England had burned the underbrush, really creating kind of almost like park-like environments. Now, from what we understand, they initially landed at Provincetown, what is now today Provincetown, at the kind of the tip of Cape Cod Bay, as you can see there. And then we think from what we can gather, they built a smaller vessel to sail north to Plymouth. Okay, Plymouth had corn that was recently planted, thanks to the Native Americans. They had a useful harbor, the cleared fields, and a brook of fresh water. And as we've seen time and time again, it was basically a very common, and especially in New England, it was a common practice to establish towns on Native American lands really throughout the New World. And we have examples of this, such as Cusco, Mexico, Natchez, and Chicago, to name a few. Okay. Now, many of the pilgrims, though, it was to their advantage, really. They looked at this as almost like a blessing, because they avoided many of the back-breaking labor needed to clear the fields, because this is very rocky part of the United States. A lot of rocks in the soil. Okay, so there are many fields that they established their towns on, which is why we have there are so many towns in New England that end in field: Marshfield, Springfield, Deerfield. Okay. However, this didn't mean that the pilgrims didn't need help, and they needed help really from the second day after their landing. Well, help came. Some help did arrive from Native Americans. However, some atrocities were also committed by the pilgrims, to say the least. First, they stole food really from Native Americans, not just planting the cornfields, but also even robbed graves. Now, we have two accounts here that describe this situation. So the first one is with regards to stealing food. In this particular description, the writer indicates that we marched to the place called Corn Hill, where we had corn before. At another place we had seen before, we dug and found some more corn, 2 or 3 baskets full, and a bag of beans. In all, we had about 10 bushels, which will be enough seed. It's with God's help that we found this corn, for how else we have done it, without meeting some Indians who might trouble us. So they felt that, well, the grace of God brought this corn to us. It was by His will that we found this corn. Okay, but there were also grave robbers, in that they said, the next morning we found a place like a grave. We decided to dig it up, and we found first a mat, and under that a fine bow. We also found bowls, trays, dishes, and things like that. We took several of the prettiest things to carry away with us and covered the body up again. So as you can see, they stole many of the what are traditionally offerings around the graves for their own use, really. Okay. Now, as a little bit of a side note, as we see the rise of New England, specifically Massachusetts, Massachusetts would become the beacon of commercialization in New England. Within a few generations, we would see a growing merchant class developing in Boston, with most of the profits gained from fish, timber, and agricultural products that were shipped to Europe and also the Caribbean. And Foner indicates that the commercial success that of Massachusetts as it grew was part and due to Puritan values. Many of these values are actually still very much with us today. Sometimes we just don't identify them. One such value be the idea of hard work and looking down on anyone who's really idle. Also, lack of devotion as well. In the 1660s and 1670s, ministers would actually reprimand those who would work on the Sabbath or Sunday. And also displays of pride, showing off wealth, and also selfishness too. There's another value which is very much with us today, and it even affected the United States for approximately 10 years during the 1920s, and that was drinking. Generally, drunkenness was also considered very looked down upon significantly, and the desire and the reliance on alcohol, absolutely, it's part. You can trace that back to these Puritan Christian values. Okay, now membership in the communities, the Puritan communities, well, is a little bit different, and it would change over time. But Foner talks about the halfway covenant of 1662, in which you receive halfway membership to those who came, to those grandchildren that came into Massachusetts during the Great Migration of the 1630s and between that and 1643. But eventually we see the rise, and we'll talk about this a little bit more. This will lead really to kind of the rise of the New England, I guess, nobility, if you want to call it that, or kind of upper crusts. Okay, where ancestry and eventually not religious devotion became the key factor. And now to go back to the Pilgrims. Now, did they travel to New England, really, or to New World, just to seek freedom to practice their religion? Well, probably not. There was probably an ulterior motive. Now, even Foner points out that a promotional pamphlet from the 1620s indicated that New England was where religion and profit jumped together. So, well, we could say that if not for profit specifically, we can at least say that they wanted a certain level of economic freedom. And these were in areas where fishing were abundant, and timber were also another major export. And also there was a desire to create a kind of economic system. In the Bodies of Liberties of 1641, we see a legislation to allow slaves to be used as a form of labor. Now, you wouldn't initiate this kind of legislation unless there was a desire for commercialization, mass commercialization. Okay. Now, amidst these growing Puritan communities, it didn't mean that there weren't individuals who disagreed with the status quo and the leadership. Now, there were such individuals. Roger Williams, for example, he arrived in Massachusetts in 1631, and he had a group called the Congregationalists who desired to, like the Puritans, really wanted to separate themselves from the Church of England. And really he preached really that a citizen can practice whatever the religion they want and that the church and state should be separate. Now this was very different than what the Puritans were basically preaching to their followers. okay, he rejected their notion that people were favored or did not have favor by the grace of God, and God doesn't favor one group over another. Now, eventually, he was banished for his teachings from Massachusetts, and would establish the colony of Rhode Island, and which gained a reputation for religious freedom. Now, in Rhode Island, institutions, government and religious institutions were separate. There was no specific church, no religious qualifications to be a resident until the 1700s. You didn't have to attend services. It wasn't a requirement. And all denominations were welcome. Even Jewish settlers were welcome as well. Okay. So, to go back to the Pilgrims, and sorry to dispel one of our sacred traditions in this country, but unfortunately, that's what historians do sometimes. It's required that we set the record straight. The Charlie Brown Peanuts version of Thanksgiving is a little bit of a story, unfortunately. And they often misrepresent the Pilgrims and the Puritan Society's ethnocentric practices. Okay. Now, around this time, we did know that Eastern Native Americans had observed an autumnal or harvest celebrations for centuries. We knew this. Okay, so to the story that they all came together for a meal, well, it's a little bit skewered. And the Pilgrims themselves, by the way, weren't even called Pilgrims until the 1870s. That's also very important to remember. And the tradition of having Thanksgiving wasn't really a holiday in our country. It was celebrated independently, but it wasn't a national holiday until Abraham Lincoln made it one in 1863 as a way of enhancing patriotism during the Civil War. Okay, and this holiday was really established to kind of establish the concept that God was on our side, that civilization conquers all, conquers the wilderness. Okay, and this idea of establishing order from chaos. A very, very repeated theme. Some themes are very common today. Now, another element of this story is the whole story of Squanto. Now, Squanto himself, you can see it from this children's book cover. His story was a little bit different. Now, Squanto, the Native American chief for this particular in this particular narrative, he had quite a journey. He had learned English because he had been kidnapped, sent to England, and managed to get back to Massachusetts. Around 1605, I think this captain actually stole him as a boy, kind of kidnapped him. He spent 9 years. That's when he spent 9 years in England, and he was employed by somebody named Fernando Georges. And then he was kidnapped. He potentially again, but historians seem to dispute this part of the story, that he was one of 5 kidnapped Native Americans. Even if Foner kind of refused this. The narrative goes that he was seized then by an English slaver, and he and 2 dozen Native Americans were sold into slavery in Spain, and they managed to escape to London, where they went then, thanks to his former employer, gained passage back to Massachusetts. Now, there's a little bit of a twist to the traditional Thanksgiving story, a little bit of an additional, information to add to that narrative, some of which, of course, is very questionable, and historians such as Foner know that, and they express their unsuredness. Okay, now to switch gears to more political matters. Now, with regards to the legal systems that were starting to be established in the New World, they didn't just come out of nowhere. Okay, they just didn't pop out of nowhere. Colonist desires, for creating a very equal system of government. Well, the ideas of freedom, especially in English law, existed really all the way back. We can trace these back to the Magna Carta of 1215. This is where King John was forced to sign a document agreeing to provide liberties to all freemen of our realm. And he was forced to sign this document by barons and lords, which basically ensured that he would not, as monarch, imprison people without charge, which a concept in a legal sense is known as habeas corpus. You'd be protected against seizure of property without due process of the law. You would have the right to the trial by jury, and you have the right to face your accuser in a court of law. Okay, and like I said, these became the symbols. This document, which is still referred to in English Parliament to this day, and also in American law to this day, became the basis of English and ultimately American freedom. We can trace it all the way back to that. Okay. Now, England itself, by this point in time, by the 17th century, by the time we see the rise of these English colonies, was going through a bit of a period of turmoil itself. Now, these notions of English freedom were really gaining traction and were a source of debates between the Stuart kings, specifically James I, Charles I. And they, again, this is part of that Protestant Revolution, and they need to distance the Church of England from the Catholic Church. And ultimately, accused kings were placed on were kind of expressing power that didn't reflect the Magna Carta. You know, they would place political opponents under arrest. Okay, they would issue taxes without parliamentary consent. So you have to see powers that are kind of unbridled in a way. Ultimately, a civil war broke out in 1642, which ended in a parliamentary victory, and Charles I was beheaded in 1649. Monarchy was momentarily abolished until 1660, when it was restored with Charles II. But in the interim period, in that 11-year period, England itself is made a commonwealth and a free state, with Oliver Cromwell as Lord Protector of the realm, and he served until his death in 1649. Okay. You also have other philosophies of freedom kind of spreading around England. There was a couple of smaller groups, but these smaller groups would, their ideas would gain traction. The first group is levelers. And they propose this idea of having an agreement, a constitution of sorts, we can even say, between, of the people for the people. They also wanted to expand the right to vote, something we see in our own political system today. But they also wanted to abolish the monarchy and the House of Lords as well, to make representation also by the people. Okay? And there was another group called the Diggers. Now we see their idea of freedom really was in terms of common land ownership, because we have to remember at this time in England, a lot of land was owned or granted to nobility. Nobility that would then either rent or control really land. And that land, if farmed by a tenant farmer, for example, would pay kind of a percentage of whatever money they earned, whatever crops they grew, to the nobility, the local nobility. Okay? So really these groups and similar groups were eliminated by Cromwellian authorities before the monarchy was restored, but their ideas really took hold. Okay? So in the next section, we're talking, as we're discussing these ideas that are spreading throughout the foundations of our colonies, let's now look really into the rise of the colonies, not just New England, but also of the colonies in general, the original, what would become the original 13 colonies. And before we delve into this conversation, there's a couple of concepts, a couple of practices that we need to discuss. One is a practice. The other are three specific acts. Now, the first concept is mercantilism. Now, this is generally a practice that was practiced generally by every European power, by and large, and it's this concept of providing to the mother country. Okay, this is the concept of strictly controlling the flow of materials, and also goods too, general goods. Generally speaking, profitable raw materials would be only exported to the home country, where in turn manufactured goods would be then imported from the home country. Okay, because there was a huge demand, especially in the English colonies, especially you can also say in the Spanish colonies too. There was a desire to emulate home. There was a desire to represent Englishness, because you have to understand that many of the first generation colonists, well, they missed home. They missed England. And subsequent generations who had even never been to England wanted to maintain this English culture. And we're going to go through that a little bit too. Now, mercantilism did allow for a level of smuggling to take place. And really this was due to really lack of enforcement. Efforts were made, though, by Parliament to curb smuggling. There was the Navigation Act, specifically those of 1651, 1660, 1663. Am I going to ask you what the differences are between those three on our exam? No, I won't. So don't worry. If you don't know the specifics, just know Navigation Acts and their importance in terms of control over the colonies. Now, they really wanted to establish global trade and really wrestle out of the control of the Dutch and then keep it for themselves. And these acts were particularly designed to address valuable goods, very valuable goods such as sugar and tobacco. And these acts demanded that those particular goods could only be shipped on English ships to English ports on firm trade routes. Now, the problem with the firm trade routes, is the well-established trade routes, is that everyone, specifically other English sailors, knew about them. Because remember, this is also an age of this is the golden age of piracy. So we start to see piracy on the rise because they knew where these trade routes were. Okay, so these navigation acts, yes, they would benefit the home country for the most part, rather than being sold, say, to Dutch ports at a higher price, who would offer a higher price. So it kept the economy, it kept the monies that could be earned within the country, within the colonial empire of that particular country, with specifically England. Okay, so that's very important to understand. Now we also see changes, political changes into the New World as well, partially due to the actions of England, really, for the most part, and in the establishment of a new colony where freedoms were even taken away. Now, in 1660, when the monarchy was reestablished under Charles II, the Royal Charter was issued to the Royal African Company, really granting them a monopoly on slave trade. And then, with the victory in the Anglo-Dutch War, New Amsterdam became under the control of English, and it was given to the brother of Charles II, who was then the Duke of York, to govern as he saw fit. And he renamed it, ultimately, New York. That's where New York comes from. Now, the Dutch laws that were in place in New Amsterdam were eventually overturned. And these are very liberal laws, certainly by colonial powers. We see married women can no longer conduct their own business. Their affairs were now handled by their husband. They could, women pretty much were stripped of their rights. They could no longer even inherit property. So inheritance went to firstborn son. Also freemen, freed slaves, also were stripped of their rights too. they could no longer attain their skilled jobs. So we start to see some changes, some absolute changes. And by 1688, we see yet another, you can almost call it another revolution. It is referred to typically as the Glorious Revolution. And it was a coup, really. Okay? Because with James II, Parliament was very, very alarmed by the popery. Right? They're fearing of the papal influence from James II, as specifically seen in his declaration that Protestants and Catholics could be equally tolerated, because they could practice equally. The Parliament would arrange to have William and Mary of Orange stage a coup, which was successful by November 1688. And in early 1689, Parliament then passed what became known as the English Bill of Rights, which gave undoubted rights of Englishmen, and this is very, very specific, and this is specific in terms of its influence on English freedom. And we would see something very similar in our own Constitution, inalienable rights. It would be translated, we would see this in our own document, our own Bill of Rights, or our own Constitution. Also, we see further taxation rules and also judicial rules. Taxation without parliamentary consent, and also trial by jury was demanded. What we need to understand is during this period, and this is something that would come up time and time again, especially as we get up to the Revolution. The colonists themselves were pretty much autonomous. They pretty much handled their own affairs. However, prior to this revolution, we start to see changes to the control of colonies. The Lords of Trade was established to oversee colonial affairs. By 1678, Massachusetts would themselves, in their court, argued that the Navigation Acts were not followed as they needed to be approved. Okay, so we start to see a little bit of a rebellious nature creep in. Okay, by 1680, there's a severe reduction in colonial autonomy, and we see England between 1686 and 1688 realign the colonies. So we see Connecticut, Plymouth, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, Maryland, East and West Jersey really reincorporated into the Dominion of New England, where that were reincorporated by then Governor of New York, Sir Edmund Andros, okay, who did not have to answer to local legislative bodies, the ones that were created. He appointed his own officials, vetting any member without any kind of vetting process by the community, and established taxes without approval. And then in 1689, William, who is now firmly on the throne, thanks to that coup, revoked Maryland's charter. So Catholics would be able to still worship freely, but they couldn't hold office. Okay? So it's a bit, we're starting to see some colonial changes. And with many of these changes, colonists were not happy. Okay? Now, that didn't mean that they didn't consider themselves Englishmen. Okay? In fact, quite the opposite. We start to see this growing desire to be English. And with firstborn generations, we're starting to see the desire to be English among those who've never been to England. Okay? And so we're going to talk about that in a minute, but a little bit of a digression. Foner does mention a little bit about the Salem witch trials. I just want to talk about this a little bit. We now know, or at least we think we know, that based on toxicologist history, toxicology kind of reports based on the histories, because this is a particular event, the Salem witch trials are a particular event on our early history. It is very well documented. And they think it may have been, historians and toxicologists may have think that it may have been caused by ergot contamination, kind of like almost like a fungus contamination, because it was characterized very specifically with violent muscle spasms, vomiting, delusions, hallucinations, crawling sensations on the skins. Okay, Now, they think it might have been a result of ergot poisoning simply because ergot itself thrives in warm, damp, rainy springs and summers. Basically, the exact conditions that were present in 1691. Okay, nearly all those accusers lived in the western section of the village, where it was basically a prime breeding ground for this fungus, and also that rye was the staple grain of Salem. Okay, and ergot very easily could have got into this this crop very easily. Okay, which also explains why by the following summer, which was very dry, there was an abrupt end to the bewitchments. Okay, so to turn back to this kind of desire to be Englishness, I just want to mention that very quickly. A few people were asking about the Salem witch trials for their first paper, so I just want to mention that very quickly. Now let's turn back to this idea, this growing desire to be English. Okay, we start to see the rise of a transplanted aristocracy in New Amsterdam when it was given to the Duke of York. The governors and the Duke of York would give massive parcels of land to families. You know, we see 160,000 acres to Robert Livingston, 90,000 to Frederick Philipse. By 1700, 20 million acres were controlled by 5 families. So we start to see the development of this very huge political, socio-political culture kind of developing. Okay, and by 1700, the 50 richest families in Virginia were really, and this was a practice I want to point out throughout the colonies, starting to grow in practice, not just in New York, but also in Virginia and in eventually Georgia. A very common practice. We see this over and over again. So 50 richest families in Virginia had the equivalent of 50,000 pounds, an absolute fortune. Okay? And in The Chides of Wilderness, Carl Breidenbach states, the leaders of early Boston were gentlemen of considerable wealth who in association with clergy eagerly sought to pursue in America the social arrangements of the mother country. By means of their control of trade and commerce, by their political domination of the inhabitants through church and town meetings, and by careful marriage alliances among themselves, members of a little oligarchy lay the foundations for an aristocratic class in 17th century Boston. Okay, in Howard Zinn, this is a particular quote from Howard Zinn. So he very carefully understands that there's kind of this growing oligarchy that was developing in the New World. There's something very similar to kind of create their own little kingdom, fiefdom, or if you will. And there was huge profits to be made. It wasn't as though they were poor and just trying to emulate a certain lifestyle. No, they were making a lot of money. In fact, Boston itself was really the merchandise and manufacturing hub, really, you can say, of the colonies. Eventually, a third of the British fleet was made in Boston. Okay, and huge profits were made by merchants, by manufacturers, shipbuilders, and sailors. So there was a lot of money going in and out of Boston. Okay. Even John Winthrop in 1630, as early as 1630, declared, in all times some must be rich, some poor, some high and eminent in power and dignity, others mean in subjugation. So really there was kind of the acceptance of socioeconomic polarity. Rich merchants built mansions, persons of quality traveled by coach or sedan, chairs, ate rich food and drank Madeira, right? And there was a huge system of kind of nepotism. There was no bank. There was no Bank of America like we have today, or Chase or whatnot. No, but they had to rely on credit and favoritism. Okay, so we start to see this kind of You know, the haves and have-nots, a kind of society being built around that concept. Okay. Now, there was also a rise in a merchant class. Not everyone was either dirt poor or ultra rich or ultra poor. There was also growing what we call kind of a merchant class, even a middle class, if you will. Now, they weren't consumers in the modern sense, and even Poner points this out, but they did develop a wide range of goods for such as household items. And many of these items were affordable to normal townsfolk and farmers, right? See access to books, ceramic plates, metal utensils, and tea would become a staple of every household. And we would discover the events leading up to the revolution that is basically the main reason why coffee is such a popular beverage in the United States today. Why generally most people don't drink tea. Okay, we see all the rise of other port cities like Philadelphia, which ultimately would tout itself as being the capital of the New World, which had 30,000 inhabitants by 1770. Okay, Boston itself had some degree of autonomy, economic autonomy, with the number of artisans, furniture makers, jewelers, weavers, blacksmiths. Okay, it was one of the most predominant and richest, as I pointed out, northern cities. But again, to go back, and this is our last slide for this particular lecture, there was, like I said, a desire to be British. Even our founding fathers, and we'll talk about this more as we lead up to the revolution, did not want to get rid of England, did not want to kick out the mother country initially. Okay, it wasn't just in the events leading up to the revolution. They did not want to do this until the very last moment when they thought that they can no longer not answer this question. Okay, and as I pointed out, they were British first and American second. They wanted the latest fashions. They sent their children, the elites, sent their children to be educated. They had luxury estates to really emulate those palatial residences of the old world. Okay, they even created coat of arms, and this coat of arms on the right was actually one that was commissioned and printed as book plates for George Washington. He had these printed in 1772, only a few years before the Revolution. Okay, so I mean, this is to suggest that they wanted to emulate this lifestyle as much as they could. Okay, so that's it for this week's lecture. I'll also be producing a lecture concerning we'll be going through primary and secondary documents as provided, or as I promised, and I'll hope to see you guys next week. Okay, take care. Bye.